Welcome to the late Alfred Hitchcock Presents. Today, I've succumbed to an attack of the bucolic, so here we are, down on the farm. You'd be surprised at the amount of mayhem attached to husbandry. Why, here's a slab of butter being churned to within an inch of its life. Frightful. And they're whipping cream. Savagely. Such a racket. Today's tale takes us to a farm in South Africa, where the chickens have most definitely come home to roost. Here is Being a Murderer Myself by Arthur Williams.
Being a murderer myself, I was very interested in the statement, "The best and most stimulating detective stories being written today are those that stress the puzzle of why, at least co-equally with who and how." I do not consider wasted the time spent on the puzzle of how, since it often decides whether the killer is to become famous, as a failure, or unknown, as a success. We murderers do not always make a mistake. On the whole, we are very efficient. It is for this reason, therefore, that I have decided to make public my experience of murder. I felt no animosity towards Susan Braithwaite when I killed her. I had been very fond of her once, and would have married her if she'd not been so stupid as to choose Stanley Braithwaite for her husband. Still, I had felt that if she wanted to marry Moneybags, that was her own funeral. I had hoped never to see her again. 18 months later, I found Susan on the step, suitcase in hand. When she could bear his insensitiveness no longer, she'd walked out on him and had come to me, for she felt that I would help her for old time's sake. She didn't notice that I was highly displeased. After she'd jilted me, I'd worked her out of my system, at the same time making extensive improvements on my poultry farm. I'd made the whole farm self-supporting, was able to run the whole place single-handed. But with Susan there, my routine would probably have got interfered with, and the 3,000 chickens, which were at the most awkward age, might have caught cold, or contracted some other ailment they are susceptible to. All this passed through my mind while she chattered away. I guessed in what manner she wished me to help her, and my annoyance mounted. I saw my little bit of money being spent on lawyers, my comfortable and satisfying life being disturbed, in short, the whole of my nicely settled life being completely upset. I became so enraged that I thought, really, I could wring her neck. The actual strangling was more difficult than one would have thought. By crouching behind the back of the couch, I was able to press her neck and head firmly against it, and so, by hanging on like grim death, avoid my hands becoming dislodged by her violent kicking, hitting, and threshing for air. Her face, dark blue with grotesquely protruding tongue, was rather shocking when contrasted with the pretty animated expression it had had a few minutes before. After making sure that Susan was dead, I pushed her tongue back into her mouth and proceeded to dispose of the body in the manner I had been stimulated to devise when reading of the difficulties other murderers had experienced in this respect. About 3 weeks later, Sergeant Theron of the local police turned up and wanted to know if I knew anything about her Mrs. Braithwaite. Sergeant John Theron on duty was a different man from the off-duty Johnny Theron, who occasionally, when suitably warmed, entertained us in the backyard of Wiggins' pub by giving a demonstration of Wild West six-shooting. I knew, by the way his question was worded, that he was sure I did know something about Mrs. Braithwaite. I told him that she had been to see me one evening about 3 weeks before, but that she had left again the same night. I went on to tell him that she had wanted me to help her, that we had quarrelled, till she'd finally walked out of the house, leaving her hat, gloves and suitcase behind. Theron asked to see her suitcase. He opened it. On top was a brown handbag, which was found to contain some money and a few loose keys, one of which fitted the suitcase. Theron then asked me what Mrs. Braithwaite had been wearing that night. I gave him a genuine-sounding, yet worthlessly vague description of the clothes I had carefully packed, together with the handbag, in the suitcase 3 weeks before. Theron pulled out the one dress in the suitcase, which had obviously been worn, and asked me if that was the dress Mrs. Braithwaite had worn that evening. Of course, I replied that it was not, but I knew that if that dress had already been described by anyone who'd seen Susan going to my farm, that description would be more or less the same as the one I had given. After asking a few more unimportant questions, Sergeant Theron left, taking the suitcase with him. I knew it would only be a matter of time before I saw him again. When Theron eventually came, it was with a man from the CID headquarters in Johannesburg. Inspector Liebenberg professed himself sorry to trouble me, but would I mind if he had a look around? I started the tour by taking them to the 300 feet long, subdivided, intensive-type poultry house. I showed the policeman the incubator room and the brooder house. I then took them to the large corrugated iron barn which housed my machinery. A tractor, a threshing machine, a hammer mill, and various smaller machines, and my stocks of food. Round the sides of the barn were rows of large storage tanks, variously containing whole and crushed maize, maize meal, meat meal, bone meal, lucerne meal, and the various other poultry feed requirements I used for making up the different balanced rations. I could see their eyes measuring the tanks and the jotting down of copious mental notes. When they had seen the whole farm, Inspector Liebenberg thanked me for my trouble and departed. Rather depressed, I thought. A week passed without event, though I began to get irritated by being under continuous surveillance. So I decided to bring matters to a climax. My best plan, of course, was to make Crippin's mistake and run away. Early one morning, I departed in my car. I headed into the veldt and hid it well away from the road. I walked the rest of the way to the underground caves. I knew the fowls on the farm would be all right, as their food troughs held enough for about 3 days. The eggs would accumulate in the batteries of nests and ultimately make a mess, but one cannot have murder without breaking eggs. On the morning of the 3rd day, I imagined that things should be about ripe for me to put in an appearance again. As luck would have it, it was Sergeant Theron who met me first when I stepped out of the car in front of my house. He demanded to know where I'd been. I told him I'd gone to the caves to see if Mrs. Braithwaite had not perhaps gone there and got lost and died there, and that I had become lost myself and had found my way out only that morning. There were men everywhere, on the roof of the house, round the house, half under the house. There were men walking about with heads bent examining the ground, men digging at various places. But the most joyous sight was the long hen house. The hens had, very unwisely, all been chased outside, so that the concrete floor inside could be examined. The diggers were being considerably hampered by the thousands of hens who were trying, with hen-like persistence, to go back where they belonged. The men became lost to view in a cloud consisting of a mixture of fine particles of manure, straw, earth, spilled food, and down. Of course, they never found Susan's body on my farm or anywhere else, nor any trace of it. They examined the stove for any signs of human ash. They dug up the drains, all to no avail. Finally, they had to give up, baffled. And no matter how much they suspected that Susan had been murdered, they had no proof. That Christmas, to show there was no ill feeling, I sent Sergeant Theron a brace of cockerels. The months passed in uninterrupted peace. My content was marred only by the news that Sergeant Theron was leaving to join the Rhodesian police. We gave him a fine farewell party, Bill Wiggins providing the drinks, while I contributed the poultry. The building of a new brooder house began to occupy all my thoughts, but doing it by myself took all my time, with the result that I could not keep my house clean and tidy, so I engaged a housekeeper. She's most efficient, yet her warm smile suggests that she could be very kind and affectionate. I'm looking forward to having an interesting time should I get this published. I am particularly curious about Theron's reaction should he read this, and so learn the make-up and constitution of those plump chickens he so enjoyed. Well, how was he to know that those chickens had been feeding on the body of Susan Braithwaite? I do not mean by crudely pecking at it. On the contrary, the fowls ate Susan in well-balanced rations. Every bit of her body had been through the hammer mill to be ground into fine bone meal and meat meal. A separate process made blood meal. These processes entailed no difficulty, as I'd learned how to do it from an article in the Farmer's Magazine. I'd only to take extra care that every single piece of the body was powdered. The teeth I had to put through the milling process a couple of times, and the hair I burned on the head, making a sort of charcoal. The meat meal, bone meal, and blood meal were fed to my experimental batch of chicks. And what fine chicks they grew into, as Theron can testify. This will surely be brought to the attention of Inspector Liebenberg. I hope the good inspector is not driven to trying to make this story of mine have the value of a legal confession. It would be a great pity if an ardent student of detective fiction, desirous of seeing a story of his own published, should be arrested because he invented a feasible explanation to account for the disappearance of a woman he happened to know. My housekeeper may turn out to be a disappointment after all. Her solicitude on my behalf is overwhelming, and I now seem to have no privacy left. She has no one to miss her, and I am most eager to rear especially good stock next season, fed with rich and well-balanced rations. The president of the National Poultry Society has expressed a desire to see my farm and the fine pullets and cockerels, for which I am now so justly famous. To quote the bard, murder most foul. Chickens make very poor suspects, since they are so difficult to fingerprint. But my taste buds are now overstimulated, and I must depart for a light repast, washed down with a full-bodied red. Rhode Island red, of course. Until we meet again, this is Alfred Hitchcock wishing you pleasant dreams. The Late Alfred Hitchcock Presents is presented by the late Alfred Hitchcock with the help of the actor Michael Roberts. It is produced by Frank Sterling at Unique for Radio 7.